Today, our program is co-sponsored by our good friends and colleagues at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, and some of you may have been involved in their dinner last night and the awards presentations and panel discussions this morning, which I'm delighted that the program is reaching out and having such an incredible effect around the world. Our program is also made possible by the generous assistance of the John Templeton Foundation, for whom we've had a real pleasure to work with for quite a number of years. Our program today is particularly timely with the growing global recession or depression, depending on where you are, and the recent elections in the United States, New Zealand, and elsewhere. How can we create economic welfare for billions of people living in desperate conditions around the world? Our event, as you know, is entitled Lessons from the Poor, The Power of Entrepreneurship, and it is based on our new book called Lessons from the Poor, Triumph of the Entrepreneurial Spirit, edited by our senior fellow Alvaro Vargas Llosa. Lessons from the Poor features in-depth studies of how private enterprise-based approaches to deal with issues of economic development by poor people in Africa and Latin America, despite economic hardship, enormous economic hardship, has produced real economic welfare. These findings stand in direct contrast to the record of command and control government measures, including central planning, redistribution, mercantilism, corporatism, and cronyism, and so forth. Instead of controlling wealth, the book advises government let people be free in order to create it. This new book is actually one of a series we are producing through our Center on Global Prosperity. Another recent volume is entitled Making Poor Nations Rich, edited by Benjamin Powell. It's published by Stanford University Press. Another you'll find in your packet called Vietnam Rising, which we literally have just gotten copies of, by William Ratliff, who is a member of the first panel that we'll be having this afternoon. As many of you know, the Independent Institute is privileged to regularly sponsor programs with outstanding authors, scholars, and policy experts to address major social and economic issues. For those of you who are new to the Institute, hopefully you all got a packet of information when you registered. To provide some background, the Independent Institute is a nonprofit, non-politicized, scholarly public policy research organization. We sponsor studies by major scholars and publish the results and organize many conference and media programs based on that. You can read and listen to past events and get many articles and studies on our website. I'd also like to recommend for those of you who are interested, I'd recommend also our Spanish website, and both of those can be found at independent.org. Many of you may also be interested in our journal, which is called the Independent Review, and in your packets there's a brochure about that. If you'd like to see some sample copies, just let us know. The format for today's program is broken down into 4 sessions this afternoon, beginning with a special keynote presentation, followed by 2 panels, and concluding with a closing keynote presentation. Afterward, we will have a book signing by the authors of Lessons from the Poor and perhaps even Vietnam Rising. To introduce our keynote speaker, I'm delighted to introduce the man responsible for Lessons from the Poor. As I mentioned, Alvaro Vargas Llosa is Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute and author of our book, Liberty for Latin America, which received the Sir Anthony Fisher International Memorial Award in the year 2006. His weekly column is nationally syndicated by the Washington Post Writers Group, and his many other books include The Che Guevara Myth, Guide to the Perfect Latin American Idiot, and many others. Last year, he was named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and he has recently completed the 4-part National Geographic documentary special on Latin America entitled Consequences. So I'm very pleased to introduce Alvaro Vargas Llosa.
Thank you very much, David, for that most generous presentation. Thank you for being here. We're really honored to have you here for what promises to be a really illuminating event. I'm not going to be giving a full talk today. I'm going to play more of an MC role. I will be making a few remarks about the general theme of this event before I introduce the President. Let me simply explain how we will proceed today. After I do my short presentation, President Quiroga will be addressing you, and then we will jump straight into our first panel discussion, which will be centered on countries that have undergone an important measure of free market reform in recent years, in some cases recent decades. And our speakers will tell us how these countries, through free market reform, were able to unleash a torrent of entrepreneurial activity, and through that activity to reduce the impact of poverty in those countries. After that, we will have a short 15-minute break, and then we will reconvene to have our second panel discussion, which will be centered on lessons from the poor. We will hear from the authors of most of the chapters of the book about those cases of entrepreneurial success. These are success stories in poor countries, in most cases by very poor individuals or families, or in some cases even communities, who were able to overcome tremendous obstacles and create wealth in very adverse circumstances. And after that second panel discussion, William Easterly will be closing the program with what I'm sure will be a very interesting talk. We do have time constraints, but we will try our best after each one of the two panel discussions to open up a short Q&A sessions, because I'm sure some of you would like to participate, but we will be as strict as possible with the time of this. Let me make a very brief little statement about the general theme of today's event, which is the power of entrepreneurship, and tell you a little bit about what we sought to achieve with this volume, Lessons from the Poor, which came out in English recently, is going to be coming out in Spanish next year. And we have already heard from German publishers who are interested in translating it into German. So we're hoping to spread the word as much as possible. In recent years, observers of entrepreneurship in developing nations have focused on the unrealized potential of urban squatters, whose illegal enterprises are pregnant with economic promise, almost never on those who have beaten the system from within to achieve prosperity for themselves and countless others. Consequently, many people think that wealth transfer, both from rich countries to poor countries, and from the haves to the have-nots within underdeveloped nations, is a precondition for lifting the masses out of poverty. Even those who understand that entrepreneurship spurs economic development tend to believe that turning the poor into business people requires distributing substantial amounts of capital to them in the form of cheap credit or government-provided education. In rich and poor countries alike, the intellectual elites equate free markets with large corporations whose exploits, facilitated by their political connections, tend to concentrate wealth, hence the appeal of populism in countries like Bolivia or Venezuela, and even in the United States, I might add. As we found out in researching Lessons from the Poor, multiple cases of individuals in Peru, Argentina, Nigeria, and Kenya that turned rags into riches in a relatively short period of time, thanks to their entrepreneurial drive, turn upside down the notion that foreign aid and redistribution programs are the best way to help the poor, that cheap credit and government-controlled education is a precondition for enterprise among the have-nots, and that free enterprise capitalism is inherently immoral and oligarchic. In case after case, we see the power of creative enterprise defeating inflation, punitive taxation, suffocating regulation, scant access to credit, or seed capital and business environments dominated by crony capitalism. Economists who defend free enterprise capitalism usually speak in terms of aggregates, curves, and statistics, and refer to the market as a mechanism for capital accumulation. Consequently, free enterprise capitalism sometimes comes across as a dehumanized, otherworldly process that sacrifices the individual to larger imperatives. These stories, and many more like them, remind us that free enterprise capitalism is all about the little guy. They demonstrate that big corporations are only possible because of little guys with the capacity to dream and who beat the odds to transform the world in response to the diktat of ordinary consumers who saw value in what they were offering. Even in societies that have attained a high degree of development, aspiring entrepreneurs constitute the essence of the capitalist process. They are the ones who innovate, forcing the big companies to adapt and oftentimes displacing them from the top. The very process of rationalization that makes a company dominant in a market makes it bureaucratic. As a result, innovation comes from aspiring entrepreneurs and smaller companies. That was the story of the technological revolutions of the last century, up to the IT era, which was triggered by startups and young visionaries. One would think that the overwhelming evidence pointing to the role of the entrepreneur in wealth accumulation would make it obvious that governments need to eliminate obstacles and offer secure and stable environments so that people can go about their business with the expectation that their efforts will not be ransacked by those who exercise authority or by third parties. In such circumstances, the success stories found in Africa and Latin America would multiply endlessly. So now let me introduce President Jorge Quiroga. He's a former head of state of Bolivia. He's truly one of the shining stars of the Latin American political firmament, which is pretty dark right now. His voice is often heard throughout the continent in defense of political democracy and free market capitalism. He is engaged right now in a very courageous battle for those principles in his own home country in Bolivia. But as I said, he's also a very powerful voice across the entire continent. He's a very powerful speaker who not only speaks as a politician, but also as an intellectual, and who tends to use very effective humor when addressing his audiences. Jorge Quiroga is not only a former president, but also a former vice president. He was the youngest person to ever hold office in his country. He was also a Bolivian Minister of Finance and an Undersecretary of Public Investment and International Cooperation at the Ministry of Planning. He was born in Cochabamba in 1960. He received his bachelor's degree in industrial engineering from Texas A&M University and an MBA from St. Edward's University. He's a recipient of the World Leader of Tomorrow Award from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and he has served as governor for the World Bank, Andean Development Corporation, the International Finance Corporation, and the International Monetary Fund. Please welcome President Jorge Quiroga.